The steel-gray waters of Light Gulf churned beneath the massive invasion fleet. As dawn broke on October 20th, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur stood on the bridge of the USS Nashville, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he gazed toward the Philippine coastline that had haunted his dreams for 2.5 years. The man who had once fled these very shores in the darkness of defeat was returning with the largest naval armada the Pacific had ever seen. "I shall return," he had promised the Filipino people when he escaped Corregidor Island in March 1942. Now, as 650 ships stretched across the horizon like a city of steel, MacArthur was about to make good on that vow. The weight of redemption hung heavy in the salt air, mixing with the acrid smell of diesel fuel and the anticipation of 37,000 soldiers preparing for the most ambitious amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet had transported the invasion force across treacherous waters, dodging Japanese submarines and weathering typhoons that seemed determined to prevent this moment. Behind MacArthur stood Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army, his stern face betraying none of the nervousness that gripped his stomach. They both knew that failure here would not only doom the Philippines, but potentially extend the war by years. According to reports from the Office of Strategic Services, as documented in classified military intelligence briefings of the time, Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita had transformed the Philippines into a fortress archipelago. With over 400,000 troops distributed across the island chain, the beaches of Light appeared deceptively peaceful in the morning light, their white sand unmarked by the devastation that was about to unfold. Palm trees swayed gently in the tropical breeze, creating an almost serene glow that belied the deadly fortifications hidden in the jungle beyond. Japanese observation posts, invisible to the naked eye, tracked every movement of the approaching fleet through powerful telescopes and rangefinders. MacArthur adjusted his signature aviator sunglasses and turned to his aide-de-camp, Colonel Lloyd Lerbes. "Signal all units," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. "Operation Kingdom begins in 1 hour. May God have mercy on our souls and damn the enemy to hell." The preliminary bombardment had been underway since before dawn, with battleships and cruisers hurling thousands of tons of explosives onto suspected Japanese positions. The USS Pennsylvania, USS California, and USS Tennessee battleships that had risen from the mud of Pearl Harbor like avenging angels unleashed their fury upon the defenders. Each 16-inch shell that screamed overhead carried with it the rage of a nation that had been surprised once but would never be caught off guard again. As the landing craft began their final approach to Red Beach and White Beach, MacArthur could see Filipino civilians emerging from hidden caves and jungle shelters, waving makeshift American flags fashioned from scraps of cloth. These were his people, the ones he had been forced to abandon in the darkest hour, and their faces bore the scars of 2.5 years under the brutal Japanese occupation. Today, he would begin the process of washing away the shame of Bataan and Corregidor with the blood of his enemies. The die was cast, and history held its breath. The first wave of landing craft hit the beaches of Light at 1000 hours, their steel bows grinding against the coral sand as machine gun fire erupted from concealed Japanese positions. Private First Class Bobby Hendricks of the 1st Cavalry Division tumbled from his Higgins boat into knee-deep water that quickly turned crimson with blood. Around him, men screamed orders and curses in equal measure as mortar shells exploded in geysers of sand and salt water. Major General Vern Mudge's 1st Cavalry Division had drawn the assignment to secure Red Beach, while Major General John Hodges' 24th Infantry Division simultaneously assaulted White Beach. 3 miles to the south, the Japanese had prepared for this moment with typical efficiency, transforming every coconut grove and rice paddy into a killing field bristled with machine gun nests, spider holes, and camouflaged artillery positions. Colonel Aubrey Newman's 34th Infantry Regiment advanced inland, through a nightmare of twisted metal and shattered palm trees. Japanese snipers, tied high in the coconut palms like deadly fruit, picked off American soldiers with methodical precision. Each step forward cost blood, but the momentum of the assault could not be stopped. Behind the infantry came the engineers, frantically clearing obstacles and laying down steel matting for the tanks and artillery that would soon follow. The Japanese commander of the light garrison, Lieutenant General Shiro Makino, had deployed his 16th Division in a series of concentric defensive rings, designed to bleed the Americans white before they could establish a secure beachhead. His soldiers, veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that retreat meant dishonor and death meant glory. MacArthur himself came ashore at 14:30 hours, wading through the surf in his trademark khakis and aviator sunglasses. The famous photograph of this moment, the general striding confidently through the waves, while explosions erupted in the background, would become one of the most iconic images of the Second World War. But the reality was far grittier than any photograph could capture. The beach reeked of cordite, blood, and death, while the constant buzz of flies served as a grim reminder of the human cost of liberation. People of the Philippines, MacArthur announced into a portable radio transmitter that had been hastily set up behind a pile of sandbags, "I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples." His voice carried across the airwaves to resistance fighters hidden in the mountains and to civilians cowering in their homes, bringing the first real hope they had felt in nearly 3 years. The fighting raged throughout the afternoon as Japanese counterattacks tested the American perimeter. Banzai charges erupted from the jungle with terrifying suddenness. Waves of screaming soldiers wielding bayonets and swords and suicidal assaults against American machine gun positions. The 24th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion bore the brunt of one such attack, losing nearly half its strength before the Japanese wave finally broke against their desperate defense. As darkness fell over light, the Americans had established a beachhead 6 miles wide and 3 miles deep, but they controlled little more than a toehold on the vast island. Japanese artillery continued to rain down from the hills, while infiltrators probed the American lines seeking weak points to exploit. The night would bring new horrors, as both sides settled in for a battle that would determine the fate of 27 million Filipino souls and the course of the Pacific War itself. Dawn on October 21st brought no respite from the nightmare that light had become. The tropical jungle, thick as green concrete and humid as a steam bath, swallowed entire companies of American soldiers as they pushed inland from the beachhead. Every vine could conceal a sniper, every fallen log might hide a machine gun nest, and every stream crossing became a potential killing ground where Japanese defenders waited with the patience of hunting spiders. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci's 6th Ranger Battalion led the advance into the interior, their mission to locate and secure key terrain features. Before the main force could exploit the breakthrough, the Rangers moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, their faces painted with mud and their equipment wrapped to prevent any metallic glint that might betray their position to enemy observers. Behind them came the regular infantry, laboring under the crushing weight of ammunition, water, and medical supplies necessary to sustain combat operations in this green hell. The Japanese had transformed the jungle into a three-dimensional battlefield, with fighting positions carved into hillsides, bunkers hidden beneath massive tree roots, and communication trenches that allowed defenders to appear and disappear like deadly phantoms. Lieutenant General Makino had studied the American tactics used in previous Pacific campaigns and adapted his defensive strategy accordingly. He would trade space for time, falling back from one prepared position to another while inflicting maximum casualties on the advancing Americans. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez of the 96th Infantry Division found himself pinned down in a bamboo grove as Japanese machine gun fire chewed through the thick stalks around his position. His squad had been advancing toward Hill 120 when the ambush erupted, catching them in the open with no cover except the bamboo itself. 2 of his men were already dead, their bodies sprawled in grotesque positions among the shattered vegetation, while 3 others screamed for medics who could not reach them through the deadly crossfire. The heat was unbearable, a living thing that pressed down upon the soldiers like a suffocating blanket. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while humidity levels approached 100%. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion even before enemy fire could find them, their bodies unable to cope with the combination of tropical climate, physical exertion, and psychological stress. Water became more precious than ammunition, and salt tablets were consumed like candy as soldiers fought to maintain their electrolyte balance. As documented in field reports from the 24th Corps, compiled by military historians in post-war analyses, Japanese defensive tactics on light represented a significant evolution from the suicidal frontal attacks that had characterized earlier campaigns in the Pacific theater. Disease proved almost as deadly as enemy bullets. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery ravaged both armies, filling hospitals and aid stations with victims whose eyes burned with fever and whose bodies wasted away despite the best efforts of military doctors. The jungle itself seemed hostile to human life, a primordial ecosystem that rejected the intrusion of modern warfare with passive malevolence. By nightfall on the third day of the invasion, American forces had penetrated nearly 10 miles inland, but progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Each hill, each stream, each cluster of native huts had to be fought for individually. The jungle had become a vast cemetery where the living and dead lay side by side, separated only by the thickness of mud and the mercy of Providence. The morning of October 23rd dawned with an ominous silence that made veteran soldiers check their weapons and scan the sky with nervous eyes. At 0-8-30 hours, that silence shattered as the largest air battle in Philippine history erupted overhead. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet carriers had moved within striking distance of Light Gulf, but so had every available Japanese aircraft from bases throughout the archipelago and Southeast Asia. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from the USS Essex, found himself facing odds that would have been considered impossible in any previous war. His 12 F-6F Hellcats encountered a formation of over 60 Japanese aircraft Zeros, Fulls, and Kates, all bearing down on the American invasion fleet like a swarm of angry hornets. But Campbell's voice crackled over the radio as he called out targets and coordinated the defense. Bandits at Angels 20, coming in from the northwest. All units, tally-ho. The sky above Light Gulf became a three-dimensional chessboard of death, with aircraft diving, climbing, and turning in deadly ballet that left vapor trails etched against the tropical blue. Lieutenant Junior Grayroy rushing dove his Hellcat through a formation of Japanese dive bombers, his 650 caliber machine guns chattering as he sent vols spiraling into the sea. Around him, other American pilots pressed home their attacks with a skill and determination born of 2 years of hard-won experience in Pacific combat. Below the aerial melee, Japanese kamikazes broke through the fire screen to hurl themselves at the invasion fleet. The destroyer USS Ward, the same ship that had fired the first American shots of the Pacific War at Pearl Harbor, now found herself targeted by a lone Zero whose pilot had already accepted death as his destiny. The kamikaze struck the Ward's forward magazine, and the ship that had begun the war disappeared in a column of flame and smoke that rose 1,000 feet into the tropical sky. On the escort carrier USS St. Lo, Captain Francis McKenna watched in horror as a Zero fighter approached his ship at wave-top height, its pilot visible in the cockpit as he made his final run. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns filled the air with streams of tracer fire, but the determined Japanese pilot flew through the defensive barrage as if it were merely a rain shower. The impact, when it came, tore through the flight deck and detonated the aviation gasoline stored below, turning the escort carrier into a floating inferno that could be seen for 50 miles. The ground battle continued to rage even as the air war unfolded overhead. Colonel Aubrey Newman's infantry had advanced to within sight of Tacloban Airfield, the key objective that would allow MacArthur to bring in land-based aircraft to support further operations. Japanese defenders had turned every building, every drainage ditch, and every clump of palm trees into a fortress, forcing the Americans to fight for each individual structure. Technical Sergeant William Fournier of the Corps of Engineers found himself crawling through a drainage culvert beneath the runway, his body pressed against the slimy concrete as Japanese grenades exploded overhead. His mission was to reach the control tower and determine whether the airfield could be quickly repaired for American use. Behind him, his squad mates provided covering fire while enemy snipers sought targets among the advancing infantry, as documented in official Navy reports from Task Force 38 operations, compiled by the Naval Historical Division. The aerial battles over Light Gulf represented the death throes of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The Japanese defense of Tacloban Airfield centered around a series of reinforced concrete bunkers that had been constructed during the early months of the occupation. Each bunker required individual assault, with infantry advancing under covering fire from tanks and artillery. The 3rd and 2nd Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion lost nearly 40% of its strength in the 6-hour battle to secure the runway, but by evening the stars and stripes flew over the control tower. As the sun set on October 23rd, American forces controlled both the beachhead and the primary airfield, but at a staggering cost. Hospital ships anchored offshore overflowed with casualties, their decks slick with blood despite the continuous efforts of Navy corpsmen and doctors. The Japanese had fought with a ferocity that surprised even veteran Pacific Theater commanders, turning every position into a miniature Alamo where surrender was not an option and death was preferable to dishonor. The battle for light had become a grinding war of attrition that would test the resolve of both armies and determine whether MacArthur's promise to return would become reality or merely another broken dream in the graveyard of the Pacific. October 24th brought with it the largest naval engagement in human history, as Admiral Takeo Kurita's first striking force emerged from the pre-dawn darkness of the Sibian, sea-like steel leviathans risen from the depths. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, each displacing over 70,000 tons and mounting 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing as much as small automobiles, led a fleet that represented the final gamble of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral William Halsey, commanding Task Force 38 from the battleship USS New Jersey, received the contact reports at 0600 hours. His staff officers crowded around the plotting table as radiomen fed a steady stream of information about Japanese fleet movements. The enemy plan was becoming clear, while Kurita's heavy ships approached from the west. Admiral Jisaburo, Ozawa's northern force, would serve as bait to lure the American carriers away from Light Gulf, leaving the invasion fleet defenseless against the massive guns of the Japanese battleships. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston had spent his entire naval career preparing for this moment, though he could never have imagined facing such overwhelming odds. His ship, displacing barely 2,500 tons, was part of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Unit 3, a collection of escort carriers and destroyers that had been designed to provide air support for ground operations, not fight a climactic naval battle against the most powerful warships ever constructed. The sea itself seemed to tremble as the Japanese battleships opened fire at a range of 20 miles, their massive shells creating waterspouts that rose higher than skyscrapers. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, caught in the open with nowhere to run, absorbed hit after hit from the enemy's main batteries. Her thin armor, designed to stop aircraft bullets rather than battleship shells, offered no protection against the devastating bombardment. Within 30 minutes, she was listing heavily to starboard, her flight deck awash and her crew abandoning ship. Captain Robert Copeland of the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts made the decision that would define his legacy and the honor of the United States Navy. Faced with Japanese cruisers and destroyers that outweighed his ship by a factor of 10 to 1, he ordered a torpedo attack against impossible odds. "We're making a torpedo run," he announced over the ship's intercom system. "The outcome is doubtful, but we're going in. May God be with us all." The Samuel B. Roberts charged into the enemy formation like a terrier attacking a pack of wolves, her 5-inch guns firing as rapidly as her crew could load them. Gunners May First Class Paul Carr, wounded by shrapnel from a Japanese shell hit, continued to serve his gun mount even as blood streamed down his face and arms. When the mount jammed, he attempted to load the next round by hand, his devotion to duty transcending the normal boundaries of human endurance. Aviation radioman Harry Mackenzie, flying from the escort carrier USS St. Low in the TBM Avenger torpedo bomber, found himself attacking the battleship Yamato with nothing more than depth charges intended for anti-submarine warfare. The massive Japanese ship loomed before him like a floating mountain, her anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with deadly fireworks. Mackenzie pressed his attack to point-blank range, releasing his improvised ordnance before pulling away through a storm of shell bursts that turned his aircraft into Swiss cheese. As documented in post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers, conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the ferocity of the American destroyer attacks convinced Admiral Kurita that he faced the full strength of Halsey's fleet rather than a small screening force. The carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, under the command of Captain Douglas Johnson, launched her aircraft despite taking hits from Japanese cruiser shells. Her flight deck crew worked frantically to spot planes for takeoff, while damage control parties fought fires and flooding below decks. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led his composite squadron into the attack, knowing that his obsolescent Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers represented the last hope for the invasion fleet. By mid-afternoon, the sea around Light Gulf had become a graveyard of burning ships and floating debris. The destroyer USS Hull, torn apart by enemy shell fire, sank with her guns still firing. The Johnston, her bridge destroyed and her captain mortally wounded, continued to fight until the rising waters finally claimed her. These small ships and their crews had accomplished the impossible, turning back the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled through sheer courage and determination. Admiral Kurita, believing he faced superior forces and confused by contradictory reports from his subordinates, made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 15:20 hours, with victory within his grasp, he ordered his fleet to withdraw. The Battle of Samar was over, and with it died Japan's last hope of destroying MacArthur's invasion force and prolonging the Pacific War. The morning of October 26 dawned with smoke still rising from the shattered remains of both fleets scattered across hundreds of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, having been decoyed northward by Admiral Ozawa's sacrificial carrier force, raced southward at flank speed in a desperate attempt to engage the retreating Japanese battleships. The greatest naval commander in American history had been outmaneuvered by his own aggressive instincts, leaving the invasion fleet to fight for its life against impossible odds. On land itself, the sound of naval gunfire had been replaced by the more familiar thunder of artillery and mortar shells as both armies settled into a brutal war of attrition. Major General Franklin Sibert's 10th Corps had advanced nearly 15 miles inland from the invasion beaches, but each mile had been purchased with blood and measured in individual foxholes rather than strategic objectives. The Japanese defenders, following Lieutenant General Yamashita's strategy of elastic defense, fell back from one prepared position to another, while inflicting maximum casualties on their pursuers. Corporal Danny Martinez of the 7th Infantry Division found himself crouched in a water-filled shell crater as Japanese machine gun fire chewed through the vegetation around his position. His platoon had been reduced to 8 men from its original strength of 42, victims of enemy fire, disease, and the crushing psychological pressure of continuous combat. The faces of his surviving comrades bore the 1,000-yard stare that marked men who had seen too much death and absorbed too much fear to function as normal human beings. The Filipino civilians caught between the opposing armies suffered terribly. During these October days, entire villages disappeared beneath American artillery barrages aimed at suspected Japanese positions, while Japanese soldiers executed civilians suspected of aiding the invaders. The liberation that MacArthur had promised was proving as destructive as the occupation it sought to end, turning the Philippine Islands into a charnel house where the living envied the dead. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton's 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment had been dropped behind Japanese lines to secure key bridges and communication centers, but their mission had become a nightmare of survival against overwhelming odds. Surrounded by enemy forces and cut off from resupply, the paratroopers fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that surrender meant torture and execution. Their radio operator, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, continued to transmit position reports and intelligence upgrades, even as Japanese shells bracketed his concealed position. Private First Class Joe Hayashi of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a Japanese-American unit whose loyalty had been questioned by their own government, proved their patriotism with blood and sacrifice on the Hills of Light. Despite facing an enemy who shared their ethnic heritage, these Nisei soldiers fought with particular ferocity, knowing that their performance would determine whether their families would be welcomed back into American society after the war ended. The psychological toll of continuous combat began to manifest itself in ways that military psychiatrists were only beginning to understand. Battle fatigue, shell shock, and combat exhaustion filled 8 stations with men whose bodies were uninjured, but whose minds had been shattered by the constant stress of mortal danger. Captain William Stevens, a battalion surgeon with the 24th Infantry Division, worked 18-hour days treating wounds both physical and psychological, his medical training inadequate for the scope of human suffering he encountered daily, as recorded in classified intelligence reports from the Office of Strategic Services. Declassified decades after the war, Japanese resistance on light was coordinated by a network of underground bunkers and communication tunnels that had been under construction since 1942. The arrival of the 1st Army Air Forces squadrons at Tacloban Airfield marked a turning point in the campaign. Colonel Paul Wertzman's 5th Air Force fighters and bombers could now provide close air support for ground operations while interdicting Japanese supply lines. The P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs that roared overhead carried with them the promise of air superiority and the eventual victory that had seemed so uncertain during the dark days of the invasion. By the end of October, American forces controlled most of Eastern Light, but Japanese reinforcements continued to pour into the island from other parts of the archipelago. The campaign that MacArthur had hoped would last 30 days was evolving into a months-long struggle that would test the endurance of both armies and determine the ultimate fate of the Philippines. The general, who had promised to return, was learning that liberation would prove far more costly than conquest had ever been. The rains came in November, transforming light into a vast swamp where men fought and died in knee-deep mud that sucked at their boots and soles with equal tenacity. The monsoon season had arrived with biblical fury, turning every stream into a raging torrent and every road into an impassable quagmire. American supply lines stretched thin as trucks and tanks bogged down in the mire, forcing soldiers to carry ammunition and medical supplies on their backs through terrain that seemed designed to break the human spirit. General MacArthur stood in his command post at Tacloban, studying intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of Japanese resistance. Lieutenant General Yamashita had reinforced Light with 4 additional divisions, turning what should have been a quick victory into a prolonged campaign of attrition. The Japanese commander, known as the Tiger of Malaya for his conquest of Singapore, was proving that his defensive skills matched his offensive reputation. Sergeant First Class William Thompson of the 96th Infantry Division led his squad through the ruins of Ormoc, the key port city that had become the focal point of Japanese supply operations. The town had changed hands 4 times in the past week, each exchange costing hundreds of lives as street fighting raged from building to building. Thompson's men moved like ghosts through the rubble, their uniforms torn and their faces gone from weeks of continuous combat. The Japanese had transformed Ormoc into a fortress city, with every building prepared for defense and every street covered by interlocking fields of fire. Captain Yoshio Tsunoda's 3rd Battalion of the 101st Regiment had been ordered to hold the port at all costs, and his soldiers were prepared to die in place rather than abandon their positions. The fighting had taken on the characteristics of medieval siege warfare, with attackers and defenders locked in mortal combat at ranges measured in feet rather than miles. Naval bombardment from offshore destroyers had reduced much of the city to rubble, but the Japanese defenders used the debris to their advantage, creating new firing positions among the ruins. Every pile of concrete and twisted steel became a potential sniper's nest. Every basement and sewer tunnel a route for infiltrators seeking to strike at American command posts and supply dumps. Lieutenant Mary Rodriguez, an Army nurse serving with the 42nd General Hospital, worked in conditions that would have challenged doctors in medieval plague cities. Her aid station, located in what had once been a Catholic church, overflowed with casualties whose wounds defy description. The combination of tropical diseases, combat injuries, and psychological trauma created a medical crisis that stretched resources beyond any reasonable limit. The Filipino resistance movement, coordinated by Colonel Russell Volkman and his American advisors, provided crucial intelligence about Japanese troop movements and supply operations. These guerrilla fighters, many of whom had been fighting since the initial Japanese invasion in 1941, knew the terrain intimately and could move through areas where conventional forces would be quickly detected and destroyed. Captain Jesus Villamor, a Filipino pilot flying with American squadrons, had become a symbol of liberation for his countrymen. His P-51 Mustang, painted with both American and Philippine insignia, prowled the skies above Light seeking Japanese aircraft and ground targets. Villamor's knowledge of local geography and weather patterns made him invaluable for close air support missions in terrain where a single mistake could result in friendly fire casualties. As documented in medical reports from the Pacific Theater compiled by the Army Medical Department, combat fatigue casualties on Light exceeded those from any previous Pacific campaign, reflecting the intensity and duration of the fighting. The final Japanese counteroffensive came on December 7th, 1944, 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant General Suzuki Sosaku's 35th Army launched coordinated attacks against American positions throughout the island, hoping to drive the invaders back into the sea. The assault began with artillery barrages that turned the night sky into a hellish landscape of fire and smoke, followed by infantry attacks that tested every American defensive position. Private First Class Anthony D'Amato of the 3rd and 2nd Infantry Regiment found himself in a foxhole that had become his grave as waves of screaming Japanese soldiers charged through the wire. His Springfield rifle grew too hot to hold as he fired clip after clip into the advancing enemy. But still they came, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades with a determination that transcended rational understanding. Only the arrival of Sherman tanks at dawn ended the assault. their machine guns and main armament breaking the final Japanese attack. By Christmas Day 1944, organized Japanese resistance on light had finally collapsed. The cost had been staggering, over 15,000 American casualties, and nearly 70,000 Japanese dead. MacArthur had kept his promise to return, but liberation had demanded a price that would echo through the generations of families who lost sons, fathers, and brothers in the green hell of the Philippine jungle. The invasion of light had lasted exactly 6 to 7 days, proving that even the determined and well-prepared enemy could not stand against the industrial might and military skill of the United States. But victory had come at a cost that sobered even the most optimistic American commanders, foreshadowing the bloody campaigns that would be necessary to complete the conquest of Japan itself. MacArthur's return had been successful, but the road to Tokyo would be paved with the bones of heroes from both nations, who paid the ultimate price for victory in the Pacific War.